Hello everyone. So in our last video, we finished up our unit on databases. We had looked at ORM software and how we could use it to integrate queries directly into RESTful endpoints. In this final segment of this course, we're going to switch gears and begin talking about more specialized web technologies, either those that solve a very specific problem or those that give us a more ergonomic or just different way to do things that we've already covered earlier in the series. So in this first video, we're going to look at web components. Web components are a way for us to write new custom HTML tags that we define ourselves in JavaScript. We'll look at how to declare a web component, see how they're laid out and styled, and then explore some ways that we can take our component and make it more reusable and make it something that we can adjust and put in each one of our pages or even multiple times on a page. So with all that said, let us begin. And for this week, I've done a lot of starter code for us. We've got a basic Express app that is just serving some static content in a client folder. In our client folder, we've got an index.html that has no body, but is linking to one JavaScript file. And that JavaScript file is going to be the web component that we'll make in this video, which is this thing is going to represent a navbar element that I want to show up consistently page by page throughout my whole website. So for this, I've got three little files I've put in their own folder to represent the code of my element, the HTML of my element, and the CSS of my element. So for my navbar, if I want to create this thing, I can do that exactly the way that I would describe it in my page. I could say here in index.html, I've got a nav element, and in that nav element, maybe I've got a menu which has list items like a home page and a mission page and an about us, maybe a contact page. And then after the menu, maybe there's also a span that says hello, whatever user. And I could define all of this directly in my HTML. But the problem with this is every single time I made a new page and added it to my website, when I wanted to make that navbar also appear on that second page, I would need to copy all of that code every time. And if eventually I changed the layout of my website, I would have to update it here, and on every single page, one after the next. And that's really what it is that web components are trying to solve. So these grew out of the different web component frameworks that came before them, things like Angular, Meteor, React.js, all these libraries that kind of do the same thing web components do. They've been around longer, so they have some more features, more of an ecosystem built around them. But web components are native to the browser, implemented directly in every major browser at this point. So if we get our code working with that, we can expect that they'll be supported pretty much in perpetuity. So for our web component here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to describe just the fragment of my page that I want repeated here in my HTML file. So I've got my navbar here, and all of this same content is going to be here just like it was when it's on our page. And when I am styling this web component, I can apply all of the same rules that I would apply anywhere else. I could say, oh, well, maybe my nav item needs a background color, and I'm going to make all my items use flex layout so that they can show up, kind of take up whatever space they need to. Maybe give myself some styling on the menu, some styling on each list item. Maybe if I want to get extra fancy, even make a little hover effect so that they fade in and out as you hover over them, using a little trick with very light transparency. But now I've got styling for this component and I've got structure for this component. The way that these things are going to be brought together is in our JavaScript file here. So whenever we're making a new web component, the way that we actually represent a web component in our code is by constructing a class. So for this navbar, I can make a class called something like maybe custom navbar. And this class, like every class, needs a constructor, and it's going to have whatever methods are related to it. But one special thing about this class is if we want it to be an HTML element, we need to inherit a lot of behavior that every element has by default. Fortunately, classes in JavaScript have inheritance. So all I need to do is say, hey, this custom navbar, it extends HTML element, and that's going to tell JavaScript, okay, this thing, it has a .set element, it has a .style, it has all of those things that we would expect from every other one of our tags when we're interacting with it in JavaScript code. That means my constructor is going to need to call super. Super calls the inherited constructor, so it makes sure it does all the HTML element setup when we set up one of these navbar elements. But then once I've done that, I've now got something that represents my tag. I'm not done yet, and that is because I also need to tell my JavaScript to actually register this thing as a tag that should be available in HTML. The way that I do that is by adding custom elements to the custom elements registry. So I can say custom elements, just like how document is this variable that always exists in browser JavaScript, custom elements always exists, and I can define on it some name of a tag, like webdev navbar, and then define what class is associated with that tag. So here I'm saying, when someone does open bracket webdev -navbar, close bracket, what I actually mean is make one of these objects right here. So the neat thing is this is integrating the HTML view, the declarative view of our web page, and the code view, these classes that are object oriented, in that document object model. This is what's linking them together. Conventionally, when we are creating a custom element, we do use two words separated by a dash. Normally, you put your namespace here, something that represents your company or group or yourself if you are just publishing these things solo. Sometimes people also use them, just make sure their tags have two words. That convention exists just so that there are fewer conflicts if you are importing components made by other people. But now, once I've done that, my tag exists. I could go out right now and make a webdev navbar tag in index.html to represent this navbar element that we're creating. But if I refresh the page right now, we still wouldn't see any content. I need to go and link the content from my HTML and CSS files to this navbar element here. And what that means is my navbar element is going to need its own little document that represents the content just for this navbar. The way that we do that is by creating what is called a shadow root. So a shadow root is a really cool name for a really boring concept. The idea of a shadow root is that we can create a DOM that is completely encapsulated and separate from our normal DOM. So if I put this little function call here, attach shadow, that's saying make a fake HTML document that exists just for this navbar. When this navbar is created, it gets its own shadow realm of tags and styling that can't leak out. It is all trapped in there, but that will still be rendered on the page. When I do this, I now have a root element that has been assigned to this element that I can use to attach anything exactly the same way I would use the document element. On this shadow root that I've created, I can query selector to find things that are on it. I can append a child to add new HTML to it. I can do anything I could do with a normal document, but the only stuff that's going to live in here is stuff that is relevant to being a navbar. So now that I've created this shadow root, I also need to actually fetch these two files and bring them here. So that's a little bit tricky. And if you're doing this in a production app, there are a couple different strategies. Some developers literally just write their text here as strings, say, oh, well, the HTML I want is my nav element and my menu element in there. They lay out the whole thing right inside this same file. Me, I like keeping them separate. I find some value in HTML files being HTML files and style files being style files. If you feel the same way, it's not hard to get those things here. I can grab the HTML by just calling fetch. Say, get me whatever the current path is, the import meta, and then resolve from this current file that we're in right now, find me the navbar HTML. And if I fetch that navbar HTML from the current path and then await this, I can actually get back all of the content of this page by just calling the HTML.text function exactly the same way we would do with any other web request. Just because this is a file doesn't mean we can't still fetch it. As we saw, files are just HTTP requests. They return text. I can avail myself of that text if I need to. The way that I'm actually going to attach this to my shadow DOM is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit of sleight of hand to make it at least somewhat efficient. I'm going to create what's called a template element. So I create a template tag, and this template tag is going to hold just the fragment of this text. So the template's inner HTML is that response of that web request cast into text. So now I have this template tag that has all of these tags in it. If I want to attach this to my shadow root, all I need to do is say, root, append a child to yourself. But I'm not going to put this template tag in there directly. I'm going to get that template's content and clone it. Make a clone of all of that content. If I put true, it says it's a deep copy and it should copy everything, get a clone of everything in there. The reason I'm doing that is because if I do have a web component that might appear more than once on a page, say I'm making Facebook posts and each post is going to be its own web component, I don't want one copy of the HTML for this thing. I don't want one element so that if I change the name on one, it changes that on all of them. Instead, I want each new element to get its own copy of this template text, this filler for what my navbar should look like. In navbar's case, there's only going to be one of them, most likely, so this is probably overkill. But it shows you a good method for doing this that will be flexible for any type of element you've got. So now we've looked at how to attach HTML. We can do something very, very similar for the styling. I can say I've got a CSS file that I'm going to fetch out and await. Hey, import meta, resolve from your current location the navbar CSS. And once I grab this navbar CSS, I can drop it into a style sheet exactly the same way that we dropped a HTML page into a template. I'm going to make a styling CSS style sheet. So I've got this style sheet here, and I'm going to say this styling style sheet, I want to replace all of the text in it with whatever the text was of my CSS file. So it's going to go fetch this CSS file, drop it into this style sheet object. And this is what happens every time you write a style tag in your HTML. Then in my constructor, once I have loaded all of the HTML content, I'm going to say this shadow root, this fake document that exists only for this nav element, it's going to get an adopted style sheet. It is going to adopt this styling page here. And as soon as I do that, now my HTML and my styling are both associated with each other and associated with this navbar element. That is, after fixing one little typo right here. Then when I go to my browser and I reload the page, there's now a nav element here. And all of that styling that we applied to it applies here. All of the HTML shows up. But if I go and I look in the inspector for this page, there's still just a web dev navbar element that we created. There's nothing in here. None of that HTML is actually part of this web page directly. Instead, you can see there's this shadow root that's linked inside of it. And if I open that up, then we can see our nav with our menu items. All of that is still there, but it's sort of hidden away. It's only accessible because we set open. You might have noticed when I attached shadow, I had the option to set the mode to open or closed. If it were closed, you wouldn't even see that at all in here. You would just see this tag that we created. And the neat thing about this is if I go and I apply this to my other web pages, say on my second web page, I go and I grab this JavaScript file, I don't need to write this whole navbar again. I can just do the same thing I did on the first one. Say I've got a web dev navbar. And if in the future I do need to change this thing, I only need to change it in this one place. Maybe I decide I want to add a page or remove a page. I just add or remove a link here, and every single page gets updated at the same time. So now we've seen the basics of a navbar. What I want to do, or rather of a custom element, what I want to do next is look at how we can add some other features that we would expect of our HTML elements and the way that we use them for standard native elements. So one big thing is the ability to write attributes that affect what this thing is doing. In our object-oriented model, this should just be attributes of this class. Like when I create a input element, I expect input.value to just be something that lives right on this. Unfortunately, to make custom elements work, needs to be just slightly more tricky than that. If I want to create an attribute that I can reference in HTML and also in JavaScript, the way that I'm going to do that is by adding it to a collection of observed attributes. And the reason I have to do this is because it makes JavaScript aware that when this thing changes, it needs to go and update it. It tells the browser that, hey, if someone edits a username field, that has some logic associated with it, and you're probably going to want to update the web component. So get ready for that. And you can add as many attributes as you want here. Maybe our navbar would have a username and it might have, a preferred color theme or something. Whatever attributes you want to define on your HTML tag, each one of those attributes gets added to this observed attributes getter that gives us back an array. If we actually want to write those changes, so say in our case, we don't want to say hello user, we actually want to greet whoever is logged in, I can do that. I can say, oh, well, this is the logged in user little span here that mentions what the username is. In my web component, I can say if, or not if, rather the attribute changed callback is a function that will take in whatever name of the attribute is we're changing, what the old value was, and what the new value is now. In here, I can say, well, if the attribute that changed was username, then I can do whatever logic my component is supposed to do to account for a change in username. So maybe in this class, I say, oh, well, that shadow DOM that I've got, the stuff that represents this web component, I want to go query select that logged in user ID. So I've gone and grabbed that logged in user ID, and I can say, oh, well, his inner HTML is going to be whatever this new value is, so that anytime someone sets a username attribute on my tag, it goes and runs and updates whatever the username is in my component. And the cool thing about this is now if I go back to my web page and I refresh this, in my WebDev navbar here, if I add an attribute to this and say, oh, well, the username is actually some username, then it's going to update this in real time. It is using this state that we set here in the HTML. And anytime it changes, it also changes the layout of this thing directly. And that's really powerful because it means when we are writing an HTML page, we can do something in a web component and then just treat it as markup when we are actually writing out our web page. So to give you an example of a time that this is relevant, I have, for instance, a web version of my resume. And in that web version of my resume, I've got CV entry tags that I've created. In those CV entry tags, you put in position equals something, years worked equals something, the job title equals something. And you can create this tag that when you're actually editing and updating your resume, you just write out each position as an HTML tag, no worrying about styling, no worrying about layout. And it will format each of those things to be exactly the same, and you can drag and drop them. I use this for my syllabi as well in all of my synchronous classes. I have a scheduled out list, and each lecture is just another lecture tag that has a title, and it has a link to some content, and it has a date that it's performed. You can use this on any type of website where you either have content that's repeating again and again with just small modifications, or you've got content that you want to be consistent on every single page as you navigate page to page. You want something that looks kind of similar. So that gives us attributes. The one last thing I want to show you in this video is that we need to do a little bit more if we want to be able to also manipulate this from JavaScript. So the big problem that we have right now is we can edit this by getting one of our tags and calling .set attribute and .get attribute, but that's not typically how we work with these attributes for native elements. For native elements, when I've got an input, I can just do input.value. When I've got a div, I can just do div.innerText. If I want that attribute style accessor for my attributes here, I can do that by writing a couple more functions on my navbar. I can write a get function for my attribute. Say, oh, well, when someone does my tag dot username, what I actually want you to do is this dot get attribute username. This says, oh, well, go out to the HTML and it's living there, so you can fetch it from there. Similarly, I could say set a username to a new value. When someone does my tag dot username equals, take that new value and this set attribute username to whatever that new value is. And if I add those two last little getters here in my JavaScript, and now if I head back on over to my web page, I've got something that not only can I access and change these attributes from inside the HTML, I'm not just limited to adding things here. I can go in my dev console here and say, hey, document, I want to go and grab that WebDev navbar. So I've got that WebDev navbar. Its username is now some other person. And when I do that, the page updates, that element updates. I can say x dot username. What is that username? It gives it back to me. I could use this somewhere else in my code. Maybe this is me fetching an attribute that was related to an input from inside my component. I can bubble them out this way from the shadow DOM back into the real page. I can even create one of these things from scratch. I could say a second navbar equals document create element, a WebDev navbar. And now I've got a second one of these things. I can take this second navbar, say document body, append onto this body a second navbar. And when I do that, suddenly now there are two copies of this thing. Remember what I was saying before, that one of the big uses of web components is to create reusable bundles of things that show up on your page again and again. If you've got something like a social media website and you've got this infinite scroll of posts, if each post is a web component, all you have to do is go and fetch from your posts endpoint, get back all of that data, and then create an element for each one of those posts. Just assign a couple attributes to it, the author, their ID, and the post content, and then append those into a div, and you're good to go. The entire thing will style itself because all of that styling was defined in a modular way inside these little page fragments that we've declared in our JavaScript code, saying, oh, well, this is what one of these things looks like. This is how one of these things is styled. And here is all of the code that is attached to it, all of the functions that can be called, all of the attributes that we're looking for. So this has been an introduction to web components. There's a lot more you can do with this. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, it's also very common for people to use a library that actually uses web components itself. Libraries like React.js and AngularJS work in basically the same way. They have this same concept of constructing a class, or at least a function, which is how we used to make classes in JavaScript, to represent some element, and then binding attributes to that element so that we can change them from HTML. They'll very gently modify the syntax in whatever way makes it seem best for the maintainers of those libraries, but the same basic concepts will still be here. From here, we're going to continue looking at other web dev technologies. In our next video, we'll be looking at other endpoint frameworks that give us the same functionality as Express. So I look forward to seeing you there, and I will catch you all in the next one.